So, Juan Guaido, the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, in lieu of Nicolas Maduro, who he's attempting to unseat there, has, in an interview with the AFP, refused to rule out calling for U.S. intervention and inviting essentially American troops into the country to overthrow the current government. This is somewhat significant. Now, he has said this before, but you can always write these things off as sort of a fluke, going rogue or whatever. If this were a mistake, which the first time he said it was, I believe, earlier this week to Christiane Amanpour of CNN, or maybe it was last Sunday, you could expect that, okay, well, maybe that was a mistake, and somebody would have pulled him aside, or one of the Americans he's talking to would have told him, hey, no, we're not ready to do that. You can't just go around calling for that sort of thing. So the fact that he has said it again, and using almost the same language to another media source, tells me that he's being led to believe by the Americans that is a possibility. On the one hand. Now, on the other hand, it could just be that he is desperate and sees the writing on the walls that he may lose, seeing as how he doesn't really have any military support from what I've seen. So he's trying to pressure the Americans any way he can. So this is either a last-ditch effort or it's a sign that that U.S. help really is on the way for him. Now, I tend to lean towards thinking that the U.S. is planning to step up its intervention based on a few things, but mainly they're based on personnel decisions that Trump has made. First of all, the National Security Advisor is John Bolton. John Bolton's never been a fan of the current Venezuelan government since it was installed. He has a few regimes that are on his hit list still, Iran and Venezuela being the top two. The fact that Trump appointed Bolton National Security Advisor after, who was it? McMaster, I think, left, signaled to me that we are there are going to be at least one more war started during his administration. That's just the nature of how Bolton is. Now, the interesting thing about that was after Trump appointed Bolton was when he announced that pretty much there's going to be a complete withdrawal from Syria, and also now he has appointed Khalilzad, who is a U.S. diplomat, to begin negotiating for a peace with the Taliban. So with the wars in Syria and Afghanistan coming to an end, I had to think that Bolton had something else up his sleeve if he were to tolerate that, because frankly, I would have expected somebody like Bolton to resign in protest if the president simply unilaterally pulled out of two wars without at least the intention of starting another one. So Venezuela seems to me is the most likely candidate for U.S. regime change coming up. And now Bolton is not the only reason I think that. There's also the recent appointment of Elliott Abrams. Elliott Abrams is someone who, frankly, I didn't even know was still alive. Who's known for working in the Reagan and also the Bush 43 administrations. During the Reagan administration, he worked kind of notoriously with Latin American dictators, helping them out. People like Rios Montt, who was committed genocide during the time. All in the interest of keeping out communists, I guess. The fact that someone like Abrams has been appointed to really spearhead the U.S.'s policy on the Venezuelan crisis tells me that while there may not be any overt invasion Vietnam style, there's definitely, as we speak, going on covert operations, by the intelligence community, which is what really Abrams specialized in during the 80s. And we've seen at least somewhat of a confirmation of this now. Grain of salt, this is coming from the current Venezuelan government, so not necessarily the most reliable source, but it seems to fit up with my general hypothesis, and that was a report that the Venezuelan Navy captured a ship from Miami that was headed to Venezuela, carrying, of course, American arms. They were mostly Colt rifles and things, and quite a few Magpul PMags. So definitely American equipment, and it was bound for Venezuela. Very likely that was going to guerrillas allied with Guaido. And this was, of course, discovered about a week maybe or so after Abrams had been appointed to this position as special envoy. The media, all the while, is fawning over Guaido, from what I can tell, which is pretty ironic considering how offended they seem to be at the thought of a foreign power interfering in domestic elections when it was the Russians interfering in the United States' election. Apparently, the U.S. interfering in Venezuela's politics is not at all beyond the pale, according to these people. Now, that's not to say that the election process in Venezuela was necessarily fair and free. I don't know about that. I'm not an expert, and I'm not necessarily even that big of a fan of popularly elected presidents. I don't think that that's necessarily a great way of picking your leaders. But for the hubris and hypocrisy of some of these people to suppose that the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the UK and Canada, who I believe were the early supporters of Guaido, have any more right to dictate who is and who is not fairly elected in countries that are not their own. I think it's pretty rich. I think for now, though, the situation in Venezuela can only get worse. If a war does break out, I think it'll end up being one of the worst refugee crises that the U.S. has ever experienced, because Brazil and Colombia are pretty much tapped out as far as how many migrants they can take. They've already taken 3 million Venezuelans between the two of them. If a real civil war or a U.S. invasion were to take place, you would probably see something on the scale of the Syrian refugee crisis like they had in Europe, except it would all be funneled into the United States. And of course, just like with the Syrian refugees, you'd see many people who were not from Venezuela following the Venezuelans up and claiming to be Venezuelan refugees just so that they can get out of their own troubled countries. That's about it.